Hello, welcome to Recovery Demystified, a show where we explore our relationship to substances from a radical, non-religious, and empowering lens. Our sobriety is not a purity contract. It is an invitation to become curious about ourselves and find our own unique paths to growth and healing. If you've been questioning the role of alcohol or drugs in your life and haven't found the resources that you need, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello. Welcome back to Recovery Demystified. My name's Early. I'm so happy to have y'all here today. I'm glad you're back for more. I'm proud of you for surviving another week again. I think that you're doing an amazing job. It can be a lot of work to turn the gaze inwards and work on reflecting on something that we really want to change with ourselves and do that healing work. And I see you doing that by pressing play on a recovery podcast. You have the choice in today's modern society to listen to absolutely anything that you want, but you're here doing this. And to me, that tells me that you care about yourself and you care about growing and changing. And I think that that's really cool. So I'm proud of you for that. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into neuroplasticity, reconstructing our brain based on our own desires. And we're going to build on that skill that we learned in Recovery Resources episode number 31, which is Stop Fighting with Yourself, Train Your Brain to Stop Cravings. So if you didn't listen to that one, I would suggest starting there or listening to that one after this. And the deep dive that we're taking today, we're going to expand on what we learned about addicted voice recognition technique and distinguishing when our addicted voice is speaking to us and be able to separate and unblend from it and go back into our core self. And in addition to that, we are going to learn about the addicted voices, two best friends that also live inside all of our heads and they're all working together to try to get us to keep doing the thing that we're addicted to. And I'm really excited to share all of that stuff with you. But before that, I would love to mention that this podcast is listener supported. There's several free ways that you can support us that take 1 millisecond of your time, but are very meaningful. And those things are, you can hit that subscribe button wherever you listen. You can rate us 5 stars, and you can leave a comment or a review. And I actually just got a really sweet review recently from Little Brother 1984, which says, "Somehow I found my way here from the folk punk world, and I'm so glad that I did. This is a refreshing and much needed take on approaching addiction and recovery. Keep up the good work." So thank you, Little Brother 1984. And if you leave us a really sweet review, I might just read it on the show. Anyway, today what I want to talk about on the show is more about thinking about our own thoughts and exactly how that helps us heal from our addictions. And I started doing one-on-one coaching work with folks. So if you find this information helpful and you want to learn how to implement it personally in your own life, then the link to book a free 20-minute strategy call with me is in the show notes. So on Recovery Resources episode number 31, we talked about addicted voice recognition technique. And that is a method where we start to think about our own thoughts. And this can seem like a really fucking weird concept at first, because especially in Western society, this is not a normal practice for most people. Most people go about their day. I think the statistic is we have like 60 to 70,000 thoughts every day, and most of them are the same as yesterday. And honestly, most of them often are not true. I think about it as my brain having this like random thought generator. Like there's kind of 2 ways to see thinking. There's the thoughts that just appear in your mind, and then there's the thoughts that you sit down and act on intentionally. And for instance, our intentional thoughts might be when we're doing like creative problem solving or future planning, or if say you're doing like a math problem, like those are active thoughts that you're trying to have. And then all of the rest of the thoughts are just the background of your brain being like, meh, 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 meh. And in Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism and things of that nature, thinking about our thoughts is really common. And I feel like I hear a lot of Buddhists call the random thought generator the monkey mind because it's really hyper and it's jumping around and it seems to not make any sense. So the invitation here is to maybe just like become open to the concept of thinking about your own thoughts and be open to the concept of choosing not to believe everything that you think. Because the idea that we're going to like control all of our thoughts and like master our thinking or whatever is harmful in nature, in my perspective, because it implements this concept of like internal hierarchy and control and forcing something, like really just elbowing your way in somewhere, when the invitation for me is to view ourselves with curiosity and gentleness. I heard someone say recently that curiosity and judgment cannot coexist. And I think that that is really true. And if we're in our brain trying to like control ourselves and like muscle through things, that is inevitably going to lead to suppression. And things that we suppress don't go away. They just get bottled up and come back out at the most inopportune of times. So yeah, the invitation here is curiosity. And if you've never thinked about your thoughts before, it can definitely seem fucking weird, but just try to be curious about things that pop up in your brain and where they might come from, and if you need to choose to believe or act on everything that you think. So we talked about last time that addicted voice recognition technique, and the gist of that is when a thought pops up in your mind, if the thought leads to a desire to use or an action to use the thing that you're addicted to, alcohol, drugs, gambling, your phone, and unwanted behavior, if it leads to thoughts of using, then that is the addicted voice. And the addicted voice comes from this ancient part of our brain that wants us to survive because it's used to getting a lot of dopamine. And I go into this in more detail in that Recovery Resources episode 31 I was talking about. And the cool thing about reflecting on these thoughts is that that brings us back into our core self, or our personality, which lives in the uniquely human part of our brain. And that's the part of our brain that's responsible for executive functioning. It is responsible for impulse control, critical thinking, and things of that nature. And the way this action of recognizing our addicted voice and unblending from it and bringing ourselves back into our core self functions within that concept of neuroplasticity is that we are interrupting the feedback loop of addiction in our brain. If we go along our whole lives just believing and acting on everything we think, if every time we have a thought of using, we say like, oh, I want to drink or I want to use drugs, then that's going along and reinforcing that feedback loop. And it makes that ancient part of our brain that has the addiction, that has the addicted voice in it, that's feeding us those thoughts. It literally creates stronger neural pathways that become myelinated in time, which means that there's like an extra thick coating around the neural pathway that makes it stronger and stronger. And then that uniquely human part of our brain that's responsible for things like impulse control shrinks and gets weaker. There's scientific studies that show that the gray matter in that part of our brain dies, and that part of our brain literally shrinks and becomes smaller when we have an addiction. So the process here, you don't have to like one day be like, oh, that's my addicted voice, and just immediately believe it and immediately be able to choose to not use the thing you're addicted to. It's all a process. So the work is to start to recognize it. Like we see it, we recognize it, and that interrupts the neural feedback loop. That starts to prune away that neural connection. And every time you interrupt that feedback loop and disidentify with it, and you say, okay, that's not me, that's my addicted voice, I'm over here in the part of my brain that knows that I want to quit, that is the work. That is neuroplasticity, and that is creating new neural pathways. You don't have to nail the action 100% of the time, but noticing and interrupting that neural feedback loop is the work. And we live in this modern society where we're used to having instant satisfaction with everything. Like you can press a button on the internet and something just shows up at your door, or you can go on a streaming platform and just watch or listen to anything that you want instantly. And that's what our brains are used to, unfortunately. But with the concept of neuroplasticity, it's going to take some time. It's one of those, 5,000 steps in a mile, or you eat an elephant one bite at a time kind of things. So if you start doing the work and you feel like you're not progressing, just trust the process, because you didn't also become addicted overnight. It took a process. And the cool thing about the process is, okay, so there is this false notion that addiction is a disease. And there are neurological changes in the brain. And of course, you feel like fucking shit. Like you feel sick, and you are sick. However, the process of getting an addiction, according to Mark Lewis in his book, The Biology of Desire, the process of getting an addiction is the brain's, like a healthy brain's normal process of adapting to stimuli. So your healthy brain's normal process of adapting to addictive stimuli, to getting those massive dopamine dumps, is to ask for more of it. And then your healthy brain can also leave the addiction behind by reversing that process intentionally. So we create new neural pathways by beginning to identify that addicted voice and breaking off that feedback loop, and then bringing ourselves back into our core selves in our thought process. And the way we can build on this work is to understand that it's not just the addicted voice. It's not just a thought of like, I want a drink or I want to use. It's the addicted voice in conjunction with other thoughts. So sometimes it's like, it's 2 or 3 steps to get there, but these thoughts are all working together in our brain. So the other 2 main characters in this story are the inner critic, which we've all got, and a fearful voice inside of us that doesn't want to change. So I'm sure most people are familiar with the inner critic. It's the part of us that tells us that we're not good enough, that we fuck something up, that we're a loser, that we're ugly, that something is wrong with us. And the inner critic is made up of the voices of every person who's ever said anything mean to you. And a lot of people also identify with the inner critic how they identify with the addicted voice. They're like, oh, I'm really hard on myself. The same thing as like, I want a drink. But if we're able to separate ourselves and unblend from the inner critic and decide that that is not us, when we're being fed insults by the inner critic, we can disrupt the neural feedback loop and say, okay, I see the inner critic is talking to me right now. I'm hearing insults from the inner critic, and I'm choosing to not latch onto them or to believe them. I'm going to separate myself from the inner critic and come back into this core self, this part of me that loves me, this part of me that wants what's the best for me. And that separation is the work. And how the inner critic and the inner addicted voice work together is oftentimes the inner critic will throw that insult at you to knock you down. And then the addicted voice walks in to solve that problem, right? So for example, like, I don't know, maybe you feel slighted by a coworker, and the inner addicted voice is like, yeah, you're a fucking loser. Look how people treat you. And then the addicted voice jumps in and it's like, yeah, well, fuck them. Let's just go get drunk, So this storyline can be repeated a million different ways for each person's unique circumstances. But I invite people to just start to recognize it. Just start to catch it. Be like, okay, that thought is my inner critic. That's not me. I love myself, and I wouldn't say something like that to me. And I have a dear friend who likes to, when they'll hear a loved one say something mean about themselves, and they look at that person and say, don't talk to my friend like that. So there's an invitation to try that too when we're having thoughts from the inner critic. When that part of ourself is throwing insults, we can step back and be like, hey, don't talk to my friend like that. And yeah, that's the work. So connected to that inner addicted voice is this inner critic, and they're working on the same team together. And there's another invitation to also don't decide. Do whatever you want, whatever works for you. But my invitation is to not decide to hate the inner critic or hate the inner addicted voice, and try to find a way to mentally process these things where we're grateful for their presence. I talked in the last episode about the function of dopamine and how the inner addicted voice is actually trying to keep us alive because it thinks we need these large dopamine dumps in order to survive. So it's giving us all these thoughts to use the thing we're addicted to, even though we've decided not to use it anymore because it wants to keep us alive. And that's its benefit. And that's how we find gratitude for it, even though we decide not to listen to it. Same with the inner critic. So human beings historically have always been a social species, and we've relied on our strength in numbers for survival. Like, one human being out there cannot build a shelter, hunt for animals, forage for food, find water, raise children, and do everything all on their own. So we've always been together, and we don't have, sharp claws or wings, or we don't have ways to escape predators either. So our strength in numbers is beneficial for that. So our brains developed to see social acceptance as the absolute most important thing on earth, because if we were out by ourselves, it would mean an inevitable death. And that's why when we feel slighted by someone or insulted by someone or blown off, that's why it feels physically painful, because our brains know we need other people to survive. So they give us these pain messages so we can make sure to maintain our healthy interpersonal connections. And that's the same thing with the inner critic. The inner critic, even though it's being really fucking rude and inappropriate, the inner critic's goal hangs on to all of the rude things that anyone ever said to you to try to remind you of how not to upset other people to be continuously accepted into the tribe. And although I think that the inner critic is maladaptive and not helpful and rude, if we can view it as a part of ourselves that wants us to remain connected to other human beings, we can be grateful for it without having to listen to it. And I think it's really valuable to decide that we don't hate these parts of ourselves, because as soon as we decide we hate something, that is going to foster an environment of an internal argument, when what we're looking for is internal curiosity. Like I said earlier, curiosity and judgment cannot coexist. So as soon as we start judging the inner addicted voice or judging the inner critic, we lose our ability to be curious, and we lose our ability to foster that sense of listening to our core self and behaving as someone who loves himself would behave. So the third voice that's in this little crew in pretty much everyone's brains. If y'all don't have one of these parts, please let me know. But the third part that all of us have, that's a part of getting us to continue to use, is a fearful voice inside of us that doesn't want to change. And there's a reason that we have this fearful voice inside of us that doesn't want to change as well. And you'll notice that as soon as you decide to make a big change in your life, or if a big change happens in your life that's outside of your control, you'll get really fucking uncomfortable. You'll get uncomfortable in your body, and you'll get uncomfortable thoughts in your mind, even if the change is good for you. I don't know. We could try it right now, where you just exercise the thought of deciding you're never going to drink again. Just bring that thought to mind, hit pause, see what thoughts you have in your brain when you think never. I'm never going to do this thing I'm addicted to. All right. And I'm guessing what came up if you pressed pause and did that exercise is a bunch of resistance. And that resistance is normal. You get a weird feeling in your body, fearful, and you get thoughts that well, what about at my wedding? Am I not going to drink at my wedding? Or oh, what about when I go do this other thing? Am I really never going to smoke pot? When I go do this thing that I usually do, never? And that fearful voice inside of you is another protection mechanism. It's another one of those survival mechanisms, and it is related to the energy expenditures that our brain needs to function. So our brain uses a ton of our body's energy, and historically, as humans that were hunter-gatherers, we had very limited amount of access to calories. And our brains haven't changed in like 10,000 years, so we're still running on this old programming, even though now the vast majority of us have access to as many calories as we would like. But our brain runs on this idea that it has a limited amount of energy, so it creates programs, and it functions off of the like projections of the programs that it has inside of our heads instead of actually absorbing all of the information that we're seeing and experiencing every day. So like, for instance, if you walk into your house and you turn on your light, you're not actually seeing everything that's in your house. Your brain is loading the program of what it remembers your house already being like. And then if something's out of place, that's going to jump out at you and really register. And this is what your brain does for everything. And the energy that it takes to make a really big change is something that fearful voice that doesn't want to change is afraid of, because it knows it's going to take a huge energy expenditure and it's not used to having an unlimited amount of calories to refuel its energy supply. So it creates resistance, which keeps you in the same programming, so it doesn't have to use extra energy to be able to make that change. And that's just another part of you that is trying to survive, that's from an ancient time, that doesn't understand that sometimes changes are really, really good. And that's why, like, for instance, when I quit working on the ambulance, I got so used to that mandatory overtime lifestyle. I was so busy all the time. I was constantly stressed out. I was like picking vegetables in my garden with a headlamp in the dark when I got off of work because I just had no time for anything. And I thought that when I quit that job that I would experience relief, that I would be like, oh, thank God I'm not working 60 hours a week and scrounging around trying to like use every extra moment of my time to do the things that actually matter to me. I'm just going to be relieved. The stress is going to be gone. I'm going to have just free time to relax. But the crazy thing is, I stayed uncomfortable with this like inability to relax because my body had gotten so used to that go, 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 go. And that became my programming, that when I had this like extra time and I could go see my friends and I could go for a walk in the woods and I could sit and stare at the fucking wall for 10 minutes if I wanted to, it took about a year of concerted effort for me to unlearn that go, 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 even though it was like really desperately what I wanted. I had a life goal of learning how to relax, which is crazy. But that is that fearful voice that doesn't want to change. And that fearful voice wanted me to fill that time with busyness because it was used to not relaxing. And I think that bringing these things into our awareness, understanding when it is our fearful voice that doesn't want to change, when it is our inner critic, when it is our inner addicted voice, allows us to step back and have this perspective on our internal experience and not just be like confused with weird feelings in our body and like going into autopilot into this like programming that is not healthy or helpful or necessary for us. And it does take work and it takes time, but within the process, the practice of understanding that neuroplasticity is possible and that our brains always are available for growth and change, and then knowing to expect that resistance from that fearful voice that doesn't want to change. And when we go to start doing something different and we get a feeling in our body, we get a thought inside of our head that's pushing back, just knowing to expect that, we can continue to recognize it, interrupt that feedback loop, and make a different choice that furthers us towards our goal. And like I said, instant satisfaction is kind of what we're used to, and that's not how neuroplasticity works. It works through the gradual interruption of those feedback loops and the gradual creation of new structures in the brain. And if it's not happening overnight, try not to worry about it. Like, trust the process. If you catch yourself like, oh shit, that inner critic just said something rude to me. Bam, you just did the work. That was it. that was you reprogramming your brain. You can like have the inner critic insulting you for 5 minutes and be totally latched onto it and feeling shitty about yourself, and then be like, oh my God, I've been latching onto the inner critic for 5 minutes. Bam, that's you reprogramming your brain. That is the work. And yeah, it takes time, but just celebrate those small victories. As soon as you start to recognize that you're calling out those thoughts inside of your mind, not fighting with them, not trying to suppress them or beat them down, but just naming them, recognizing them, and sometimes deciding to make a different choice. And we're all going to fuck up with this stuff. Like, nobody's going to wake up one day and just understand all of their thoughts and just make 100% of perfect choices in their lives. Like, when you get to making choices that go against your goals or your personal like ethics or morals or whatever, guess who's the first one to jump in? You're right, that inner critic. So as soon as we can just, practice not latching onto those thoughts, that is going to start to regrow that prefrontal cortex, the uniquely human, intelligent part of your brain, and it's going to make your impulse control stronger. It's going to make your critical thinking skills stronger, and it's going to lead to you to be able to make positive choices in your life towards creating that life we no longer need to escape from. And I know that this works because I did it. I used to just be swept away by all of my own thoughts, think that the inner critic was me hating myself, think that I was the one who wanted a drink, and constantly listening to the fearful voice that was afraid of change. And as soon as I began to identify them, break those feedback loops, and then return to my core self, I got myself out of this fucking mess, and you can too. Anyway, I guess that's all I wanted to talk about today. And also just a reminder that I am still doing the one-on-one recovery coaching. So if this is something you're interested in and you want to learn personalized ways to implement these skills in your own life, there's going to be a link down in the show notes to book a free 20-minute strategy call with me and see if we're a good fit for each other for this kind of work. And if this episode helps you, if it makes you think of someone else, go ahead and send it to a friend who you think might need to hear this message today. And thanks for listening through all the way to the end. I'm super proud of you. You're doing a great job. You can do this. I love you. May you be happy and free. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Recovery Demystified. If you like what you heard, share it with a friend or rate and review us so we can reach a larger audience. Recovery Demystified is produced and edited by me, Early Brunner. Stevie Petet made our logo. Our beautiful theme music is by Logan Bragg, and our social media manager is Kaylee Bausch. We are entirely supported by your generous donations as a 501c3 nonprofit. You can find a link to donate in the description. May you be happy and free, dear listener.